air quality in South Asia, and our speaker is Dr. Santosh Harish. So Santosh joined Open Philanthropy in January 2022. He leads Open Philanthropy's grant making in South Asian air quality. Prior to this, he was a fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, working with the Initiative for Climate, Energy and Environment. Before that, he worked as the Associate Director Research at the India Center of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago and did postdoctoral fellowship with JPAL, South Asia. And evidence for policy design. He has BTech from IIT Madras and PhD in engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon University. So let's let's have a round of applause for Dr. Prashant.
Thanks so much, Vikram. All right. Hi everyone. I can say that's been the case for me too. So really glad that you made the time to be here and for your interest in this topic. My name is Santosh Harish. As Vikram described, I'm the program officer for South Asian Air Quality at Open Phil. This is a new program. Earlier today, Zach gave a presentation on cost prioritization and sort of talked through how this works at Open Phil. So one of the recent outputs of the cost prioritization team then is the medium investigation that sort of persuaded folks to start this new program. Over the course of the next 25 minutes, 30 minutes or so, my goal is twofold. One is to sort of talk you through the nature of the air pollution crisis in this region and the types of challenges that make it hard to tackle. And I also want to sort of walk you through a little bit, give a sense of how grant making works in this space, the types of opportunities that we think could be highly cost effective. Noting that this is at still a very fairly early stage of the program, and we expect that there is going to be a bunch of learning for us as well as grant makers. So before we start though, I thought it'd be helpful to just like warm you up and get a sense of the room. If you could lift your hands for what you think is the right answer. What do you think is the biggest source of particulate matter pollution in India? Stubble burning? Commercial trucks, cars and two-wheelers, biomass burning in households, construction dust. Cool. What does particulate matter affect in terms of health? Noting that there could be more than one correct answer here. Lung infections, lung cancer, strokes, cataract, diabetes. Cool, awesome. If there's one message, as far as the first part of this presentation is concerned, is that air pollution is a crisis that's not just limited to Delhi, it's not just limited to cities, and it's not just limited to winters, right? I'm sure that in the last few years, you've seen some version of this kind of a map. So this is the map of PM 2.5 concentrations as estimated as an annual average across the country. The first thing that should strike you is sort of the deep red, crimson or whatever it is, shade that sort of goes all the way from Haryana to stretching into Bihar, but there is also extremely high levels, 80 to 100, which is twice India's regulatory standards for PM 2.5. That's basically the entire Indo-Gangetic plain, right? Now, particulate matter or PM 2.5 are basically very fine particles that come from different sources, have different chemical compositions. It's not a single chemical substance like say a carbon dioxide or a lead. It's like a cocktail of a variety of different pollutants, right? Each of which have different levels of toxicity and so forth. And one of as you can see here, that this is a problem that has only been growing over the years. So just compared to, that was the map that you saw on the extreme right, from 98, over the next couple of decades, the problem of air pollution has only grown. And there are sort of new centers where like red spots are emerging, like this bit in Chhattisgarh in the center of the map there, right? Where we have our coal power plants and mining happening. Right then, 83% of Indians don't breathe clean air, right? In general, while the program is South Asian Air Quality, much of the presentation is focused on India for two reasons. We're here. And because my own area of expertise is largely restricted to air quality management in India, much of our grant making so far has also been limited to India. Right? So 83% of Indians don't breathe air that meets the national standards. If you look at that map, you'll see that Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal are also on the wrong side of that dotted line at 40 microgram per meter cube. Right? South India is relatively better off, but really this is an all India problem. Now, what exactly is it? So air pollution is the second largest risk factor to public health in India, second only to child and maternal malnutrition. Okay, that's a crazy number right there. It's an absurdly large problem in some ways. And it affects a variety of different health outcomes. So going back to the second question, right? We see impacts on lower respiratory infections, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, the works. And with each passing year, evidence seems to accumulate that it affects something else very badly as well. Right? The reason it has such a wide variety of impacts is that the fine particles enter the systemic circulation through the lungs for sure, but it then heavy metals and so on, which have absolutely no business being in our body, finding their way through, leading to a variety of different health outcomes. So the correct answer for that second question then was really all of the above, and if possible, more. What sources contribute to pollution exposure nationally? I found this extremely counterintuitive, and perhaps this might surprise you as well. The single largest source of pollution affecting Indians on a population-weighted basis is actually biomass burning in households for cooking, for water heating, for space heating, right? That's the single largest source. It leads to air pollution, high levels of air pollution exposure indoors, and then eventually the smoke goes out, and it causes. So this graph actually is just for ambient air pollution exposure. It does not account for indoor air pollution exposure. So that's a really big problem. After that, you have relatively more sort of usual suspects. You have coal combustion in industries, in power plants, anthropogenic dust, which is also largely from industries, fugitive emissions, and so on, but also includes things like construction dust. And then you have things like transportation. This is at a national level. If you look at a particular city like Delhi, the role of transport would actually go up, right? So there have been various studies to like ascertain the role of different sources. These are called source apportionment studies. They differ in terms of methods. They differ, when they were conducted and so on. But broadly, they seem to come to the conclusion that industry, transport, biomass, and waste burning dust are all about 20% plus or minus 10% of the problem in a city like Delhi. One way to interpret this is that to be able to make substantive progress, you can't really fixate on any one source. You need to be able to tackle multiple sources in parallel. And if we zoom into any one of these different sources, there really are a series of interventions that would be required, right? And that's one of the challenges. It's a multi-source, multi-intervention type problem. The boundaries of an individual city. It comes from the surrounding regions, from the surrounding states, indeed from outside the country too, right? Air pollution does not respect state or national boundaries. And this can actually be a significant chunk of the problem. So again, the numbers differ, but for a city like Delhi, the within city contribution could potentially be as small as 40% or so, right? 40 to 50%. The rest of it coming from outside. Again, what does this mean in terms of policy? It requires heroic levels of coordination across governments, right? At a minimum, state governments, likely across the Indo-Gangetic plain, starting all the way from the Punjab province in Pakistan going down to Bangladesh, which is what this map shows, right? It's a single contiguous airshed almost that sort of spans this entire region. The final sort of piece of complexity is that purely from like a governance framework standpoint, there are multiple agencies at the federal level, at the center level in India, at the state and at the local levels, right? The pollution control boards are sort of the principal regulators of air pollution, but their mandate is by and large focused on industrial emissions, right? For virtually every other source, you are dependent then on other agencies whose jurisdictions really cover a variety of other things. It's not obvious that they would prioritize air pollution over those other responsibilities they have. They're unfamiliar with the issue, and that therefore creates this problem of state capacity. For any of you who have sort of worked with government in India, you would know that expecting coordination across ministerial or department levels is, well, expecting a bit much, but it's essential in this instance, right? So at heart, air pollution in India or indeed in South Asia is a state capacity problem. Governance institutions in India can often be pretty good when it comes to sort of episodic delivery of services, but when it comes to routine service delivery, that often poses a challenge. And that the various researchers who have sort of framed it in different ways, calling it a flailing state, a state with strong arms but clumsy fingers when it comes to like sort of more, when it comes to services that require sort of more nuance. And the Indian government is good at episodic delivery with inbuilt exit, but the routine service delivery, right? Managing waste well, managing to keep roads well maintained and so on. Those are the kinds of things, ensuring that industries are regulated on a regular basis, that those often pose to be a challenge. And the state intervention required here are of different kinds. There is reducing pollution from industries and vehicles, which is sort of more modern sources of pollution where the instruments available to us are quite different. You set standards, you monitor these polluters against those standards. Those who are above, in theory, you would sort of take action against. Whereas other things like dust management or avoiding waste burning require improved routine public service delivery, right, in those sectors. Household burning needs provision of clean and affordable energy, like LPG or potentially electric options. And then there's the question of the process of planning and implementation itself. We require the government to be able to commission research, consume evidence for planning. And this is made harder because of the heroic levels of coordination. Now, at this point, I think you wouldn't be wrong to feel like this is a hopeless case, right? This seems like an unusually hard problem. We are expecting the state to intervene, and it clearly looks steep, which it is. And I guess there's no way around that. The reason for optimism, though, is that air pollution isn't a new problem for the world, right? You had industrial cities in the US, in Europe, who had to deal with air pollution with much less advanced science and much fewer methods and tech than we do now. We have the example of China, which has made some remarkable progress just over the course of a few years in the last decade. So it's doable, right? But how do we find them? So indulge me, if you will. I want to sort of take you through this sort of toy example of of how one would evaluate a potential opportunity to intervene. And from that, I would want you to, it sort of gives a flavor of what grant making would look like in this program, but also I think throw up the types of uncertainties that one would have to face. So we have an organization, Policy Works, that wants to work with the Punjab government to reduce crop residue burning in the months of October and November. Happens every year. It leads to some truly apocalyptic scenes. They will primarily focus on improving project management for interventions that the state government already wants to do, right? But currently has significant gaps in implementation. They ask for a funding of, let's say, $1 million over a couple of years, primarily to support personnel that will staff this particular cell within government, right? Now, how would one evaluate this? So these are completely made up numbers, so I wouldn't want you to take them too seriously. But essentially the way you would do this is look at what the expected value of DALIs averted from a project like this could be, right? So first we start with the size of the problem, which is how many DALIs are impacted due to stubble burning in Punjab, right? How much of this, so stubble burning happens in Punjab, Haryana, parts of UP. So how much of this is from Punjab, especially in terms of how does it affect health? Now, let's assume that we have those two inputs. It's about 1 million DALIs a year affected by stubble burning, half of which are from Punjab. How much of these on paper, right, with ideal implementation can be reasonably mitigated by state government interventions that are currently available? Take my word for it that that number is 30%, right, for now. What percent of these would not get realized without the process fixes or the project management fixes that this particular organization would be able to bring? And finally, what's the value of DALI averted, which is $100,000, which is standard assumption, a standard way we value a DALI averted at Open Phil. So you multiply all that, that's about 1.5 billion a year. Then we have this concept of a speed up, which is if we weren't to fund this program, right? In general, the world tends to trend towards solving its problems. So we assume that this project would happen one way or the other, or these gains will be realized one way or the other. How much is a grant that we would make truly helping, right, against that counterfactual? Let's assume that it takes about 3 years that we are speeding up this process. There is, I mean, sure, policy works can propose to do this project, but there is no guarantee that they'll be able to set themselves up within government, persuade them to sort of actually implement those changes that they say they will. So we'll put a 40% chance that they'll actually succeed in just setting up. Multiply all those numbers. That gives you over those that 3 year speed up period a value of $1.8 billion. They've asked for a $1 million grant. So that's 1800x. That seems like on an expected value basis, that seems like a potentially very effective program. Now, this isn't a completely made up proposal in that, in fact, we have made a grant to an organization that sort of would propose to do similar things. And while some of these numbers can be justified somewhat, some of these are guesses, right? What chance would an organization have to like successfully embed within government? Honestly, it's hard to say in advance. They have a track record, but some of this is quite arbitrary. So speed up of 3 years, I have no idea what's going to happen 3 years from now. So that's a best case. 2, one can reason through it, given the current sort of state of play in terms of grant making, what other funders are interested in doing, what's happening in general within Punjab government, so on. But there are a couple of these things which, at least at the moment, is just like very, very, very hard to defend. So for example, how much of this is mitigatable by state government interventions? We don't know, right? Like that number does not have a reasonable basis at the moment. It's one of those gaps in the literature. In fact, there is a fairly large list of uncertain inputs at the moment. When it comes to looking at how emissions, so let's say there is a ton of pollutant getting released into the air, it doesn't stay in one place, it moves, with the winds and so on, it might rain, it reduces, but then the pollutants also react with each other, right? And that leads to various changes. So translating a certain amount of pollutants getting released into the atmosphere into how that affects the pollution that we breathe requires fairly advanced atmospheric chemistry and dispersion models, some of which we have, but it is still at a relatively nascent stage. But that's relatively better understood, that first part. The second part on how pollution impacts health, the global burden of disease has a bunch of estimates where it's basically synthesizing evidence from like a fairly large body of public health literature. There are issues in how much of this literature actually identifies the impact in a causal way. So, I mean, there is much that we still are yet to like learn about how pollution impacts health. We have a pretty good sense that it is bad. Precisely how bad, there is some basis for it, but there is also plenty of scope for improvement, right? So those are two types of uncertainties where there is a gap in the scientific literature. It's in a reasonable place, but we could have significantly better estimates, which we inevitably will in a couple of years. How much of the emissions can be reduced by the interventions considered requires policy analysis of a kind that we don't have enough of, right? So that becomes another gap in sort of the base of knowledge. How much would governance support or process improvements help? Again, probably a big assumption. Some of these are testable through like large experiments and so on, but those are hard to do for a bunch of problem statements. I suspect that would be true here too. So that will have to be like a assumption. So I guess my point is that when we are doing some of these BOTEX, back of the envelope calculations to look at what could or could not be cost-effective grants, there are a series of inputs for which we have relatively better evidence. There are a series of inputs for which we can potentially not have very much evidence ever. And there are some where we can expect improvements over time. And there is that a bit of a judgment call and a leap of faith that you would need to take, right? But that's how we try and reconcile working with uncertain inputs. What we do try and do though is try and be as transparent about where those numbers are coming from. So if something is truly a guess and it's hard to justify, you try and be as transparent as possible and say, well, it could be this, it could be higher, it could be lower, what impact would that have on the ROI? Do a little bit of a sensitivity analysis and see if that changes your result, right? Cool, so what could cost-effective interventions in this program potentially look like? These are 5 buckets that I like to use. So there is a bunch of work on problem-defining applied research, which is how much, what are the levels of pollution in different parts of the country, right? Where do they come from? What are the sources? There is the solution evaluating applied research, which is sort of like the domain of development econ in a sense, which is can a particular intervention work, and if so, to what extent? There isn't a ton of work in this bucket at the moment. And then there are governance support grants, which basically involve organizations that end up working closely with government to either do like the project management improvements that I described earlier, or which could involve sector-specific interventions. So we want to improve the public transport infrastructure in a particular city. How many buses does a particular city need? How do you sort of solve the optimization problem of figuring out their routes, their frequency, things like that, which may require sector-specific knowledge and expertise, right? Some of which may also involve pilots to experiment what could or could not work. There is independent policy analysis that sort of think tanks and so on do. And then there is, of course, advocacy. In the absence of public pressure, many of the sort of many of the changes that we have seen in sort of air quality governance in India would likely not have happened, right? Some of this happens through the courts. The courts, in fact, have been extremely active when it comes to sort of decision making on air quality, which has its pluses and minuses, right? Some grants that we have made so far, so one of the first grants that we did in this program was measuring rural air quality across the states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar using low-cost sensors, which would basically cover every rural block in those 2 states. There are currently no rural regulatory monitors in India, and air pollution is sort of assumed just because of the absence of this regulatory information to be an urban problem. And so something we're hoping that grant will do is improve the visibility of rural air pollution. Another sort of problem-defining applied research type grant is developing new simplified atmospheric transport models that can be used for policy analysis. So if that will allow you to answer that first uncertainty on if emissions reduce by a certain delta, what impact would that have on concentrations, right? Which, for example, somebody like me would just not be able to do at the moment. Thanks. Then program management units within state and city governments, and in general think tanks working closely within government to sort of provide expert inputs. That is actually a significant chunk of the grant portfolio at the moment and will likely continue to be the case. We have multiple grants that sort of fit that description. And finally, things like assessment of stubble burning, right? We know that various interventions are being tried, but what's working? How many people are still burning stubble? Like you would require regular measurements of just the base incidence rate of fires, right? There are a bunch of alternative technologies that are being promoted by government. Are farmers using it? If not, why not? Grants, we have a grant that's looking to help answer some of those questions. So I'll stop here. I'd love to take your questions. Thanks so much. Right. There are a bunch of alternative technologies that are being promoted by government. Are farmers using it? If not, why not? Grants, we have a grant that's looking to help answer some of those questions. So I'll stop here. I'd love to take your questions. Thanks so much. Or you could just ask, yeah.
Otherwise.
I keep thinking about the thing you said at the start about this being a state capacity problem fundamentally, and especially the things about needing better public services, needing better energy infrastructure. How do you even go about like beginning to comprehend it from that point of view of like, do you see this work eventually ending up in advocating and helping to fund better waste disposal practices? Because like so many things need to change, it sounds like, for this problem to actually be tackled.
Correct. Yeah, no, I think that's, I don't know if there's an easy answer to that question. I think one reason to be sort of optimistic is that these are not questions that are like completely new or aren't already sort of politically salient, right? So the landfills in Delhi are already sort of a politically salient issue, and we have various. In fact, I think all the political parties that contested the municipal elections recently promised to do something about it. So in these instances, my sense is it's probably sort of more reasonable to expect those sectoral changes to happen almost regardless of what the benefits would be for air quality. You treat them as waste management issues first and foremost, as opposed to something that may or may not lead to air pollution. Like that lens may actually be besides the point. And because it is besides the point, and air pollution is not particularly politically salient, those might very well be one of those first things where you might see improvements in. There's something called the Finance Commission, which is basically this autonomous body that recommends how like the government's revenues get devolved between the different levels of government. So the largest sort of pot of money that has been allocated by the government for air quality work actually are these grants from the Finance Commission to municipal corporations, right? That are sort of performance based in the sense the amount of money that these municipal corporations get in subsequent years, sort of a function of how well they have performed in the past years, right? We have this interesting scenario then where the municipal corporations are the ones sort of holding that pot of money. have sort of been given the mandate to do something about air quality, they're unlikely to do completely new things. They're going to do things that they would have wanted to do anyway. So there's therefore a reasonable chance that things like roads, things like waste, might end up getting sort of more priority relatively early on. But it's not an easy problem. It's actually something that will have to be dealt with, on a city by city basis, potentially even like a ward by ward basis or something. And, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if those end up being some of the early reasons for progress. Sure.
So there is one question on swap card. Could you explain what a DALY is?
Oh, sure. Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't sort of spell it out, but DALYs are disability adjusted life years. I think one approximate way of thinking about it is essentially as just sort of life years lost, but adjusted for the quality of life, right? These estimates come from a bunch of epidemiological evidence that gets sort of synthesized in studies like the global burden of disease. Yeah, so in terms of the life years lost then, right? On a global basis, South Asian air pollution accounts for like 3% of all global DALYs lost, which might not sound like much, but it's an enormous fraction for any one risk factor to have in a particular region of the world.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Santosh, for a really interesting talk. So I would have thought of this as a problem that government should have addressed, and I very much buy your argument about state capacity failures getting in the way, as they often get in the way. But what I would have expected in order for this to be among the most neglected and high priority areas is for this problem to somehow be harder for the state to address than other problems. And so I wonder if you can elaborate on what, if anything, you see as uniquely challenging about air quality for the state to address.
That's a great question. So traditionally, the Indian regulatory state, which is basically, I think, primarily focused on the pollution control boards here, they have been set up to tackle industrial emissions, right? And that's something that they've been doing since the 80s or so. So they're basically for different classes of industries, there are specific emission standards. There is a certain protocol to like measure what the emissions are relative to these standards. There is a certain protocol of, okay, what's supposed to happen after if a particular industry is compliant. So, so industries have been sort of formally under the regulatory structure then. Since the mid-90s or so, vehicular emissions sort of became more salient, especially in Delhi. There were some fairly high-profile court cases that sort of that made this very visible, which also led to fairly large-scale changes, especially in Delhi, but also a few other big cities, on, for example, the fuel that commercial vehicles like buses or autos or taxis can use, right? But besides these two sources, none of the others were, sort of the road dust or construction dust type of things. They weren't, I think, recognized as large enough sources of air pollution till actually quite recently. It was assumed to be like an industrial problem, and then they're like, okay, industrial plus vehicular, and until the more sophisticated source attribution studies happened in sort of the mid-2010s, a whole bunch of sources were just not recognized as serious enough contributors. The household burning piece, for example, I think still suffers from that issue, mostly because the source apportionment studies happen in cities, and they wouldn't sort of talk about household. It is legitimately a much less important source in cities. So there is, in some sense, a legibility issue in terms of how different sources get treated. That said, right, with industries, despite the regulatory architecture that has existed for a while, the actual sort of compliance to the regulatory standards seems to be shockingly poor. There isn't a ton of evidence because much of the regulatory data is quite opaque, but to the extent, and there's a paper with Michael Greenstone and Rohini Rohini Pandey, who's now at Yale, which basically sort of showed how even when we look at sort of the regulatory inspections, right, something like 50-60% of the firms are routinely non-compliant. And when they're non-compliant, they're often egregiously non-compliant. To the extent that we see regulatory action against these, it happens when there's sort of repeat offenders who are at like 5 times whatever their emission standards are. Part of the problem here is that the pollution control boards are understaffed, are under-resourced, and have too few regulatory instruments at their disposal. So basically, if an industry is found to be non-compliant, you can get like polite correspondence from the pollution control board saying, well, you are non-compliant, tell us why you are non-compliant, could you do something about it, and sort of that goes on. In egregious cases, they can initiate criminal prosecution. It's a criminal offense for industries, right? And these court cases drag on for years and years on end, or nothing much happens. And because of the very poor success rates when it comes to the criminal prosecution, it has sort of become sort of by default that the pollution control boards sort of just don't do very much. So it's partly an under-resourcing problem, even with sources like industries, but it also, I mean, there's a clear need for regulatory reform, allowing for more intermediate instruments that allow regulators to take proportionate action against polluters. So it's really a combination of different issues.
So I will read there. There is one more question on swap card. I will take that first. According to you, what are some of the most effective ways in which the rising air quality index in cities like Delhi can be tackled?
The most effective intervention in all likelihood, right, but not necessarily from a cost effective standpoint, but the most effective intervention is likely to be tackling household burning, right? So traditionally, LPG has been subsidized. LPG is liquefied petroleum gas. These were subsidized to a certain quantity. Something that happened a few years back, there's a large program called the Ujjwala scheme, which increased access to this cleaner fuel. And something like 80 million households got connected in a few years, which was like a dramatic increase. That was a super promising measure that suggested that household air pollution could be reined in. However, the subsidies have since been discontinued, which means a whole bunch of households have access to LPG but can't actually afford purchasing it on any regular basis. LPG is expensive, but it's likely that if there is sort of one particularly effective intervention, it's likely providing subsidized, potentially nearly free LPG to the poorest households. I think I would think that that's the most effective intervention. The World Bank recently published a flagship report, as they put it, on what that marginal abatement curve looks like, right? What are likely to be the most cost effective. So the household burning piece shows up pretty high there. The World Bank argues that tackling excessive fertilizer use could also potentially be very effective, because excess fertilizer use leads to ammonia emissions. Ammonia reacts with various things and forms secondary particulate matter, which ends up being a fairly large chunk of the mix of pollutants in the air. I would point out that this is a claim that is largely restricted to the World Bank and some of the agencies they have been collaborating with, and there are considerable uncertainties on the science on what truly are like the levels of ammonia that get emitted from the excess fertilizer use and so on. So it's there, but there is like a bit of a caveat on how certain the claims are. Industrial emissions, and in particular power plant emissions, are another sort of top candidate for being a place to intervene. In particular, coal combustion leads to sulfur dioxide, which is again one of the precursors of particulate matter. There have been regulatory norms for power plants to install pollution control equipment to reduce SO2 emissions since 2015, which have, and like the deadlines for installing this equipment have been routinely delayed for many years now. And it's unlikely when we'll see anywhere close to universal compliance to that. But that's likely to be quite effective as well.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk. So my question was, to what extent are successful efforts to control air pollution in other countries translatable to India? So like in particular, I would be curious to know if there are any countries which have successfully mitigated air pollution problems while at a similar level of development and state capacity to India.
I think my short answer is similar levels of development and state capacity. There aren't too many good analogs. In the case of China, a significant reason why they were able to reduce pollution levels quite quickly was that they were very good at taking action against industrial emissions and makes sort of standards more stringent and so on quite quickly. That will likely be translatable here too, except that at least so far, it's not, the speed of progress has been quite slow. And it's not obvious that given the different political systems, the political economy of tackling industrial and power plant emissions would be as viable in India. But it's like purely in terms of an intervention that seems quite translatable.
Hi, this is Alicia. Thank you so much for the talk. Now, given we are talking about that household emissions is one of the highest, is causing the highest exposure to emissions, exposure being the key term for the populace. Though I wonder in Delhi, given that there's so many subsidies which are already given by the government for conversion to LPG gas, and also this gas pipeline, which has reached the far reaches, how are we looking at these? Because these numbers which we have are from 2016, and a lot of change has happened since, in both in terms of policy. Okay. But when we were looking at your chart, was talking about ambient exposure as well. So how much of this emission from the household goes into ambience outside? And like how are these studies done? And what sort of pollutants are caused by this within the households? What sort of respiratory distresses it may cause? And why are we saying that that is one major reason for suffering?
Right. No, thanks so much. And thanks also for giving me the opportunity to clarify. With the earlier question, it said what would be the most effective interventions for places like Delhi. I started with household burning, which is because I start with household burning by default. But to be clear, household burning of biomass is not a particularly large contributor in like a large city like Delhi, right? So even if we account for like airshed level movements of pollutants and so on, it would still be, you know, in like, it's probably double digits, but not too much higher than that. In fact, household burning will likely be a factor in weeks like this, where you have thousands of households and people relying on bonfires and so on to keep themselves warm for space heating, not for cooking, right? How much of the smoke indoors goes outdoors? A very, very large fraction, right? Virtually all of it that doesn't get settled down, and there's no reason that smaller particles settle down that quickly. That graph that I showed earlier was actually for impacts in the ambient and not at indoors. So in terms of the impacts of high levels of exposure indoors, it's basically all the same sort of health outcomes in that graph, but at sort of exaggerated levels, especially and sort of disproportionately on women and infants who may spend more time in greater proximity to the cook stoves and indoors, right? So yeah, as a result, I mean, the reason household burning is, I think, a deeply neglected area is therefore both because of the exposure indoors and outside in the ambient. And virtually all of it gets out there. Sorry, I feel like you have a clarifying question. Okay, sure.
Part is that you mentioned the Devesh Kumar paper which contrasts
The impacts of high levels of exposure indoors, it's basically all the same sort of health outcomes in that graph, but at sort of exaggerated levels, especially at sort of disproportionately on women and infants who may spend more time in greater proximity to the cook stoves and indoors, right? So yeah, as a result, I mean, the reason household burning is, I think, a deeply neglected area is therefore both because of the exposure indoors and outside in the ambient. And virtually all of it gets out there. Sorry, I feel like you have a clarifying question. Okay, sure.
part is that you mentioned the Devesh Kumar paper which contrasts the routine service delivery. Can you talk about something that the Delhi government is already doing to solve the problem and how effective it has been?
Okay. But sorry, I didn't follow the connection between the Devesh Kapoor paper and the Delhi government.
It's your question.
Yeah. Essentially that, you mentioned that, for example, the Indian state is effective when in terms of episodic delivery and not routine services. So say, for example, installing CNG buses, and for which I would assume
that's a
that there's
good
a
example,
one-time,
yeah.
one-time investment, and then you
Correct.
set up fuel stations.
Yeah.
How effective has something like this been, and what are some other things that
Great point. So I think there is, I mean, it's primarily like a measurement, and therefore, it's primarily like a measurement issue in that we can't be certain about this. But to the extent that we have pollution levels, evidence from like the regulatory stations and so on, there seems to have quite clearly been a dip in pollution levels in sort of the mid-2000s, mid to late that decade. And air pollution sort of went back on an uptick after that. So the shift to CNG, to the extent that we can make a claim, seems to have been successful in sort of arresting the sort of continuously increasing trend. There seems to have been a dip which subsequently was erased completely because other sources came along, the number of vehicles went up and so forth. So, but it seems to have worked quite well.
Okay.
I just want to ask you, why are farmers turning to stubble burning? What's the reason? And your slide mentions talking about alternative technology options, adoption in Punjab and Haryana. So I just want to understand if there's any popular technology option among farmers.
Sure. So basically, in the sort of in 2010, I think there was basically a new piece of legislation in Punjab. Actually, there was a similar piece of legislation that was passed in Punjab and Haryana to delay the paddy sowing period, primarily as a groundwater conservation method. The idea was that these crops, which are quite water intensive, depend more on the monsoons, right? And so if you push it back by a few weeks, the stress on groundwater reduces, because these states are also suffering a sort of a fairly acute groundwater crisis. The levels every year plummet, right? What that then ended up doing is that it pushed the harvesting of paddy to just a few weeks before wheat gets sown. So that there are two agricultural cycles, agricultural seasons, and it basically compressed the time between harvesting one crop and sowing the next crop, right? And therefore, what seems to have happened is that soon after this legislation, The other thing to note is, going back to this slide, is that there are seasonal changes in meteorology. So basically you can think of it as the temperatures become colder and there are changes in wind speeds as well. The pollutants basically get trapped. If you have the same level of emissions, everything remains the same, but just these meteorological conditions change. The layer of atmosphere that holds the pollutants basically shrinks, right? It has no escape. So just sort of mechanically, in a sense, the pollution levels go up. So if you combine this change, which happens in October, November, right, with the fact that the harvesting season shifted, it sort of was a bit of a double whammy. So the stubble burning made the sort of increase in pollution levels that would have happened anyway more severe and longer. And so in that sense, like the impact of stubble burning on Delhi and sort of downwind air pollution levels is a relatively new development over the last decade. Stubble was burnt earlier too, but it was sort of under more favorable conditions, and there was more time for farmers to do other things. There have been various technology alternatives that have been provided. The trouble is that these are fairly expensive equipment. Even when subsidized, they're fairly expensive equipment. And this is expensive equipment that you can use for like a few weeks in the year, right? As a result, persuading farmers to like adopt this equipment, like coordinate with their neighbors and like rent it and so on, has just proven to be quite hard. And there are genuine sort of gaps in implementation. So each year the subsidized equipment are made available, but they're made available in like September or October, right? It's too late. And so those are the types of things where like improved project management and improved processes internally, better planning could potentially make a difference.
The farmers say that this product or this technology really works. Is there any one or two?
So the technology in general seems to be doing okay. So there are things called happy seeders and so on, which seem to be doing quite well when used. There are some issues later on, does it increase the number of pests in my farm and so forth. I don't know if there is like conclusive evidence on it. But there also has been some recent sort of randomized control trials that look to provide incentives to farmers, which have cautiously optimistic results that could be a method that works. Basically, you pay farmers not to burn, and you sort of essentially get into a contract with them and provide incentives at a level that might be able to meet some of the costs of renting this equipment or dealing with the waste in some other way.
So since we are close to 6, we can take only one final question.
Yeah, hi. So I wanted to ask, like, how can we improve or shift upon from the policy-based solutions? So we were talking about the vehicular emissions in Delhi. That is a big problem. And right now, the implemented solutions over there is the PUC certification for the vehicles. That is to be done at regular intervals. But obviously, that involves a human intervention, and the legitimacy is obviously questionable. So how do we tackle such kind of issues?
So part of the answer has been here to like assume that, okay, I'll give you my take on this. My prior is that it's actually very hard to like reduce the levels of corruption substantially when it comes to vehicular inspections, right? With PUCs, it's too dispersed, there are too many different actors. What the Delhi government, for example, has been doing is add layer upon layer upon layer of scrutiny. So the vehicle owner gets an OTP, they have to take a photograph of they've introduced various steps, but it's always going to be like something of a chore police game. And left to their own devices, people will always figure out a way if it's sort of lucrative for them. So in some sense, one alternative here, which is what like the advocacy community has been doing, is to say, look, it's actually really hard to do very much with vehicles that are already on the road. What can we do to make the fleet cleaner? Right? How do we accelerate the introduction of like much cleaner fleets? And one of the big sort of positive things that have happened in the last few years is that the BS6 vehicles were basically brought forward. We skipped an entire generation of vehicles, and it was brought forward by a few years, primarily under code duress. Well, we now have BS6 vehicles already plying on the road. So we just wait it out for like the older vehicles to get replaced. But yeah, it's not an ideal solution, but in some instances like this, you sort of need to factor in what is sort of tractable. Yeah.
So thank you, Dr. Santosh for this wonderful talk.